I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Kansas and Wichita government and public affairs. Broadcast on Great Plains Television, channel 26.1 on Saturdays and Sundays. You can also find it at my site, The Voice for Liberty. That's wichitaliberty.org on the internet. You'll find this episode of Wichita Liberty TV, show notes for these episodes, all the other old episodes, plus all the other content that I and others produce on nearly a daily basis. So today we're continuing with our series of major candidates for the governorship of Kansas this year. We have Kris Kobach here. He grew up in Topeka, graduated with honors from Harvard, received a Marshall Scholarship to study abroad, received a doctorate from Oxford, and a law degree from Yale University. He was a law clerk for a federal judge and professor of constitutional law. He was a White House fellow in the Bush administration, serving as advisor to Attorney General John Ashcroft on immigration law and border security. In 2010, he was elected Kansas Secretary of State, re-elected 4 years later, and now a candidate for the Republican nomination for governor. He lives in rural Douglas County with his wife and their 5 daughters. And as you may know, his running mate is prominent Wichita businessman Wink Hartman. So, Secretary Kobach, welcome to Wichita Liberty TV.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So, at the Pachyderm Club today, where you spoke earlier today, you mentioned that the Kansas economy during the full year of 2017 actually shrank, became smaller in real terms. From the latest statewide job figures from March to March, Kansas grew at about half the rate of the rest of the country, except government jobs. Kansas grew at about twice the rate in government jobs as the nation. And then for the year 2017 personal income, it rose 1% in Kansas, amongst the whole nation, 3.1%. So these are some pretty, I think, really, like you mentioned at Pachyderm Club, really sad and shocking statistics about the performance of the Kansas economy. What would Governor Kris Kobach do to help us turn around from this?
Well, to put it in 2 words, cut taxes. I mean, it is so essential that you have a favorable tax environment for job growth, for economic growth. Kansas is going in the wrong direction. The other 2 states with us, the 3 states that had negative growth in 2017 were Kansas, Connecticut, and Louisiana. Look, we should not be at the bottom of the pack. We are a conservative state in terms of the political culture of Kansas. The people of Kansas want a lower tax burden, but the legislature gave us, along with Governor Brownback, unfortunately in 2015, gave us a record sales tax hike, and then in 2017 gave us a record income tax hike, which Brownback tried to veto. We should be rolling back those tax hikes, so I will be pushing very aggressively to cut spending and cut taxes, and that's the key. It has to be both a spending cut and a tax cut. And during the 2012 to 2015 period, right after the tax cuts in Brownback's period, spending was growing. If you're going to cut taxes, you need to cut spending. I'll be cutting spending from the day I get into office. In my Secretary of State's office, I came in, the office had a budget of $7 million a year. We've now whittled it down to $4.6 million, cutting it every single year in succession, lower and lower. I've proven you can cut government, and I'm going to do the same thing statewide.
And I think you probably have at least seen the book from Dave Trobert and Dimitri Herbert, What Was Really the Matter with the Kansas Tax Cuts. They've both been in that chair recently. And the problem was we weren't able to cut the spending. We had quite a bit of money in the bank when the taxes were cut, but they spent that in 2 years, and then after that there was no surplus to spend. They had to look at cutting, and Don Hyman, the House Majority Leader last year, said there's nowhere to cut. You can't cut.
He's absolutely wrong. I don't think Don Heineman has actually taken a serious look at the budgets and gone inside the agencies and seen what does this employee actually do for the salary that person is paid by the taxpayers of Kansas. Look, in my agency, we shrunk, during that same 7-year period, we shrunk the agency by 19%, number of employees. You can reduce the size of government agencies, even in a relatively small agency like the Secretary of State's office. We have an amazing demographic wind at our back right now, and that is that the baby boomer generation is retiring. And I mentioned this at the Pachyderm Club. 11,000 people a day are retiring across the country. That's about 110 people a day in Kansas, and a lot of them are in government. When those people retire, You don't fill the position if at all possible. That's what I did in my agency, and it worked. You take that person's 3 responsibilities and you divvy them up among 3 other employees who are remaining. You can do that in state government too, and other state government agencies too. We will shrink these agencies, I guarantee it, and we'll shrink the number of people. And here's another statistic that I'm sure Heinemann either wasn't familiar with or wouldn't want to talk about, and that is that Kansas ranks number 3 in America in the number of state and local employees per capita. We are a government-heavy state. We have
it's been that way for a long
time.
Yeah.
That means there's a lot of fat that can be cut when we're trying to trim down the state budget.
I think today you mentioned that your running mate, Wink Hartman, that you'd like to use his experience in business to have him take a look at some of these agencies and see what they're what we can do.
And it won't be a passive leadership style for me or for Wink. I'll be coming in and telling each agency head, okay, here's your target. Your spending is at this level. I want a 1% or a 5% or whatever the number percent of reduction in your spending. Actual dollars spent will be less by the end of the first year. And then we'll have Wink come in and say, in addition to the target that Governor Kobach just gave you, I'm going to come in and I'm going to spend 2 months sitting in your agency, going over your budget, talking to your employees, and I'm going to make additional recommendations for cuts. So there are going to be all kinds of recommendations coming into these agency heads. We're going to cut the size of the budget.
Let's take our first commercial break today for Wichita Liberty TV. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks with co-host Carl Peterjohn. Our special guest, Secretary of State Kris Kobach, who's also a candidate for the Republican nomination for Kansas governor. Carl?
We were talking about in the first segment about how Kansas has a lot of government employees, particularly state and local. Local taxes are high, have been a problem. My 8 years on the county commission, we had to face that here in Sedgwick County. I strongly supported, and the majority of our commission strongly supported, limiting property tax growth, at least with the mill levy. If we exceeded that, requiring voter approval for tax increases. How would you address big government at the local level here in Kansas? And do you support the statutory property tax lid? Because the local government lobby is spending a lot of time and money lobbying for exemptions and to try and weaken it.
Yeah, and it's already too weak. I mean, that property tax requirement that certain increases have to be put to a vote of the people, well, they've got so many exceptions, and then the exceptions keep getting stretched, and you can drive a truck through the exceptions. So we need to actually tighten the statute to make it harder for local governments to raise taxes on the people. And by harder, I mean more of the potential mill levy increases have to go to a popular vote. The people need to be able to vote on whether they want to pay more taxes locally. The other thing I think we need to do is stop the stealth tax hikes of appraisal increases. In some counties, the appraisal increases are going up in a rocket trajectory.
Johnson County, I think, is one.
It's one of them, and there are many other counties too where these appraisal increases are like 10%, 15% in 1 year. I favor a statutory or even a constitutional cap on appraisal. So you pick the percentage. Maybe it's 2% a year, or you have a mechanism for how you would set it, but. That is a stealth tax increase. In fact, when my first wade into politics was as a city councilman in Overland Park, and the appraisals were going up so fast that the council, when I was on it, had a commitment. We would roll back the mill levy just to keep the tax level the same, and it required rolling back the mill levy every single year because appraisals were going up so fast.
Yeah.
It shows how powerful and how significant that stealth tax increase is. So I think we have to protect taxpayers in that respect as well. Kansas right now has the 15th highest property taxes in the country if you average out local property and state property taxes.
Well, we're one of the few states with a state property tax, and there's a lot of talk about raising state property taxes. I assume you'd be opposed to that.
Absolutely.
But is there any way we could limit spending growth in other areas and phase down that tax? I mean, it's 21.5 mills. 20 mils for K-12 and 1.5 for capital. Is that something that might occur in a Kobach administration?
Absolutely. I'm for cutting taxes in every way we can, wherever we can. So, we'd have to decide, are we going to, we've cut, say in my administration, we end up cutting spending by this many, $100 million, whatever in this year. Okay, how are we going to return that to the taxpayers? We could return it by cutting sales taxes. We could return it by cutting property taxes. We could return it by cutting income taxes. But the bottom line is we're going to return it to the taxpayer.
Well, let me ask you, the legislature, Republican and Democrat supermajority came together, overrid the governor's veto on taxes and spending last year. How would you approach this differently than playing this battle again? Because the governor was basically he was taken out of the equation.
I think people would see a very different approach as governor if I were in that office. I would not be a passive governor. I would not be sitting in the office waiting for something to come to me, hoping there was no bad press. I would be going out there and going to the cameras, going to the reporters and saying, this is what I want. This is what I want the legislature to do. Give it to me now. Here are my 5 reasons. Make the case aggressively, intelligently, and be out there. And some people may not want a governor who's out there and making the case and speaking so conservatively, well, then they could vote for somebody else. But that's what I would be doing. I think if we were to fight that battle over again, and if I were in the governor's chair and could go back in time, I would have fought it very differently. I don't know what the outcome would have been.
What went wrong this year where it would have just simply taken just a majority of votes in the Kansas House to pass through the federal tax cuts to the Kansas taxpayers, but that was not able to pass?
That's an extraordinary failure of the legislature this year. So the Trump tax cuts created a windfall for the state of Kansas, which the state legislature, there were conservative Republicans who wanted to do this. I called for it as well. I think it was Bill 2228 that would have passed on that windfall back to the people of Kansas. That's our money. And amazingly, it fell just short. Now, I think if we had had a more aggressive campaign from the governor's office to make the case to legislators publicly and forcefully that, hey, I want that bill on my desk, that's the way I'll be acting as governor. I'll be telling the legislature, get this bill to my desk, get it to me by this date, and if you can't, then at least have a vote on it. And I want every one of you to go back to your people and defend among your constituents why you won't return their money in the form of tax cuts. We have to have defined, strong, aggressive leadership from the governor's office.
Well, let's take a second commercial break here on Wichita Liberty TV. We'll be right back. Welcome back again to Wichita Liberty TV. Bob Weeks here with Karl Peter John, Secretary of State Kris Kobach, also a candidate for governor. Last segment, when we were talking about spending limitations, I was thinking some states have tax and expenditure limitations. Colorado does. I know there's a lot of loopholes in it, but I think it's been at least somewhat effective. And those laws, and also I know you're in favor of term limits for a member of the legislature. A lot of those laws come about through citizen initiative, which is a process whereby citizens can dream up laws, they gather petitions, then the people get to vote on it. Referendum is kind of the opposite, where if the legislature passes a law, the people can petition to have it overturned or stayed or something like that. You're, I think, set out from all the other governor candidates I know of that you are in favor of this process, but others are not. And I think you've also said that Kansas is one of the few states west of the Mississippi that does not have this process. Right.
And I've studied this and actually written about it when I was a graduate student in political science. I am a proponent of initiatives and referenda. That's basically the only way we're going to get term limits. Well, it may not be the only way. I'm going to be pushing for it, but that's the only sure way to get term limits. If you look at all the states that have term limits on state legislators, almost all of them adopted it through the popular referendum popular initiative.
And that's why the legislature doesn't like it, because they know what voters do. They're going to put term limits on them.
Right. And so legislators are very reluctant to impose term limits on themselves. So you need the initiative to get these conservative things like tax lids in place, term limits in place. And why not trust the people to speak when the legislature is failing in some regard. And so that's, I'm a believer in the power of we the people to govern ourselves. The only arguments I hear against against the popular initiative is that, well, maybe you'll have some, crazy radical group that wants to, ban processing of beef.
Animals. There have been
The
animal rights issues in
well, you know
some
what?
states.
Those don't pass in a red state. There's no danger of them.
Because first of all, it's a pretty high bar to get the signatures.
Exactly.
And then it's got to be a majority vote.
The majority of the people have to vote. And so I'm not
Yeah.
really afraid of the people of Kansas adopting some wacky environmentalist initiative. So I do favor it, but of course it would take a legislative vote to bring the popular initiative. I don't see that happening anytime soon. But, to the subject of term limits, which I'm a big proponent of term limits as well, I do believe there may be a way, and I'm going to be pushing for term limits as well, not just on legislators, but also on all statewide electeds. The Secretary of State's office doesn't have term limits right now.
Treasurer, Attorney General, all those.
Yeah. The founding fathers of this country believed that there would be rotation in office. At the time the Constitution was drafted in 1787 and then the first Congress in 1789, the average tenure of a member of Congress was 1.5 terms, 3 years. And that's because they didn't want to serve any longer than that. You've got to have rotation in office. The way I would propose to the legislature that we try to do term limits, because you have this barrier of legislators don't want to vote themselves into a term limit situation. It's less than perfect, but I think it might get us across the line. Say that the term limits in Kansas will come into effect, but all of these sitting legislators will not be subject to term limits. Only their successors will be. It would be imperfect. It wouldn't be the kind we'd like to have, but that might get us finally to a situation where we have term limits on everybody in Kansas.
But Secretary Kobach, we're actually a far way. You're talking about expanding voters' power, making that clause in the Kansas Constitution where it says all political power in the state is inherent in the people.
Yeah.
Well, actually, we're in a state, I think, where all political power is inherent in the Kansas Supreme Court, and over half our state general fund budget is being controlled by the state Supreme Court. They're about to come out with an edict on the abortion ruling. I think a good argument can be made. We're in a kind of a post-democratic republic situation here in Kansas, which you as a constitutional law professor know that Article 4, Section 4 says the feds will guarantee each state a Republican form of government.
Yeah.
So aren't we really in a deep trouble when you've got the judiciary making these major budget decisions?
Yeah, you have the Kansas Supreme Court seizing the appropriations power from the Kansas legislature, and that power only belongs in the people's representatives. And
you're talking about the school of finance.
The school of finance, yeah. I know of no other state Supreme Court in this country that sets out a specific dollar amount that shall be spent on the schools by the people and basically demands certain votes from the people's representatives. There's a problem with the other clause in the Kansas Constitution governing that no person shall be liable for his votes in the legislature. You've got the court demanding certain votes. And it is unconstitutional in so many ways what the Supreme Court is doing, unconstitutional under the state constitution.
How do we rein them in?
Well, ultimately, you've got to do several things. One is new justices. When old justices retire, make sure the new ones are conservatives, people who believe in the law as written, like Caleb Stegall. We have one conservative justice on the court right now. We need more like him on the court. The other is I think we need to change the way of selecting justices. We need to go to the federal model, which is the governor or the executive appoints, and then the Senate confirms. And we now have that in Kansas on Court of Appeals judges. It has produced some excellent judges. We need that transformation to occur on the Kansas Supreme Court, a transformation to that new selection system. And I have been pushing for years for moving to the federal model for how we select Kansas Supreme Court justices.
A few years ago, we did have the retention elections where it was pretty close, within just a few percentage points of several judges not being invited back to serve another term. So,
and that's pretty amazing. I mean, those retention elections are run against nobody. But so when you're nearly losing an election against nobody,
but we've had 60 years of this system, and there isn't a single appellate court judge who's ever lost their position due to a retention election.
They were pretty close, and if you notice, also Justice Stegall, because it was his first time up, he was retained with, I don't know, maybe it was as much as 80%. Some of the others, the ones that we consider the liberal justice, they just barely squeaked by with the majority.
That's right.
I think that shows maybe people were paying a bit of attention. So, well, Secretary Kobach, one more commercial break for today, and then we'll come back with our last segment. Well, welcome back again to Wichita Liberty TV. Bob Weeks, your host. Carl Peter John, your co-host, and Secretary of State Kris Kobach, candidate for governor. So I know you don't know my wife, but she is a Democrat, believe it or not. And she's worried about some of the actions you've taken about voter ID and so forth, that represses the vote. And so she wouldn't let me go back home unless I asked if you were not confident that anyone who wants to vote in Kansas is able to do so.
I'm very confident that people can vote in Kansas. Anybody who is a U.S. citizen and is eligible to vote,
I guess, yeah.
It can vote. My motto has been, let's make it easy to vote but hard to cheat. And I think we've done that in Kansas. Photo ID is absolutely necessary to stop multiple forms of voter fraud. And it's overwhelmingly popular with Kansans now that we've had it in place. Same with
some other states have photo ID too.
There's about a dozen states that have photo ID, pretty strong laws like ours that aren't riddled with all kinds of exceptions. And then we also have proof of citizenship to register. We're one of only 4 states that has that. And then we have some other things that other states don't have. We are, without question, the #1 state in America in election security. And that's one thing I promised as Secretary of State that I would do, and I delivered on that. And I take my promises seriously. So if I say we're going to be, if I'm governor, we'll be the #1 state in defending the right to keep and bear arms, I mean it. We'll do it. So you can tell your wife that we are aware of no one in the state of Kansas who is qualified to vote and is a U.S. citizen and isn't able to vote. We do all kinds of things. If you, for example, you don't have your Kansas birth certificate, we'll get a replacement birth certificate for you for free to prove your citizenship. If you are one of those very few people who was born on a farm and never got a birth certificate back in the 1920s, we have a special procedure where you can do a telephone hearing from your couch at home and explain your situation, and the state board will certify that you are a U.S. citizen, and provide other evidence like an affidavit from your sisters or something like that.
On the photo ID too, I think a lot of people may not realize that your expired driver's license for older people is still accepted at the polls.
Right. Any expired photo ID, if you're 65 or older, you can use you can use that old passport that just has that picture of yourself that you love. That looks much better than the one you have now. You can use an expired ID if you're older. So the point is, we bend over backward to help people who need the photo ID and who need that proof of citizenship, and we do things like confirming their citizenship for them. If some other state agency has a record that you are a U.S. citizen, we will get that record from them. So it really is easy to become registered to vote and to vote in Kansas. And by the way, our numbers have been going up in proportion to other states.
I see.
When we put if you could look at the 2010 and 2014 non-presidential election years, that was right after the proof of citizenship went into effect. Our voter participation, while the rest of the country was dropping off, ours was holding steady. So we were doing better than the other states.
You were getting media beating up on you, particularly the liberal papers in the state, on this whole issue in front of federal court. What are some of the issues that aren't being told as part of that case? Because there's a lot of information out there I hear back and forth, and you're getting whacked pretty hard on this, that the federal court and the ACLU have defeated Kris Kobach. Is that true?
No. Well, the case is still the case in chief is still in front of the judge right
verdict,
now. We haven't had a verdict yet. The case is all about our proof of citizenship law. The ACLU does not like Kansas's proof of citizenship law. They don't like the other states that have it, which are Arizona, Alabama, and Georgia either. They're trying to make an example out of Kansas and trying to get the law struck down. Either way, no matter which way the judge rules, it'll go to the Court of Appeals, the 10th Circuit, and I think it'll be a pretty high chance that it might go to the U.S. Supreme Court after that. But I am absolutely committed to defending our proof of citizenship law. We have had many, many instances of non-citizens, aliens voting in Kansas, including many in Sedgwick County. And so the evidence is clear. The size of the problem is very substantial. And so we have to solve it, and proof of citizenship does it.
Do you have any sort of an estimate in terms of how many people we think may have been improperly voting?
So the improperly registered is the number we were estimating for the court, because it's a registration that we're talking about. It's a qualification for registering. So we were able to present 127 specific examples of people who are non-citizens who became registered. But the thing is, you can't just look at our voter rolls of 1.8 million and say citizen, non-citizen, citizen, citizen, non-citizen. You can't look at the voter rolls and know a person's citizen. You only find out through external information. And Sedgwick County has been doing a great job of the election office of providing some cases that they have discovered. We had an expert in the federal court case do some sampling and try to estimate the number of non-citizens on our voter rolls, and those estimates went up as high as 33,000 in the state of Kansas. And when you think of how many votes, how many elections for state legislature, for county commissioner, come down to a margin of less than 50, less than 10 votes.
We used to pull names out of a hat when I was on the county commission as we canvass. We're running low on time, Secretary Kobach. One quick question, got to get in.
Yeah.
Obamacare expansion through Medicaid expansion has been a big issue. Where do you stand on that?
I'm opposed to Medicaid expansion. Look, our state is spending way too much money in a host of areas. We don't need to expand Medicaid.
Well, that says that there. So, well, Secretary Kobach, thanks very much for stopping by today. I think everybody knows that the filing deadline for candidates is June 1st. I think we know everybody that's there anyway. But then also the primary election is the first week in August, and then the Republican and Democratic winners will advance to the general election in November. They'll be joined by a Libertarian Party candidate and then a pretty well-known independent candidate in Kansas this year. So thanks again for watching Wichita Liberty TV. Karl, thanks, Secretary Kobach, and thank you to you, the viewer.